Did you know that a whiskey tax once brought America to the brink of World War II? Yes, the same America that had won its independence from British taxes, a few years later forced its own people to revolt by taxing them. This is no ordinary story. This is the story of the Whiskey Rebellion, the moment when America's new federal government had to test its strength. Just think, on one side were the people who had just founded democracy, and on the other side were the same people who were taking up arms against their government. This contradiction is what makes this story so interesting and historic. So in today's video, we'll not only see why this rebellion happened, but also understand how it changed the future of America. And finally, I'm going to ask you a question that will make you think. So get ready, because today we're going back to the 1790s, when a bottle of whiskey became more powerful than the authority of the government. It was 1791. America had just become independent. The country's coffers were empty, war debts were skyrocketing, and the economy was in dire straits. Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the time, came up with a plan. To stabilize the country financially, we must impose an excise tax, and this tax was imposed on alcohol, specifically on whiskey. Hamilton thought the wealthy would be able to afford the tax, but he forgot that in rural America, especially in western Pennsylvania, whiskey was not just alcohol, it was currency. People traded with it, paid off debts, and stored their hard-earned money in it. So when the government taxed whiskey, it was an attack on their daily lives. Now think of it through the eyes of a farmer who lived in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. He couldn't get to town to sell his crops because the roads were rough and cash was scarce. So he would make his own corn into wine, sell it, and make ends meet. But when the government taxed him, he felt like his hard work was being punished. We fought against British taxes, and now our own government is robbing us, the farmer said. This phrase was the real spark for the rebellion. At first, the protests were peaceful. People would hold rallies, hold banners, and petition the government. But as time went on, anger grew. Tax collectors were attacked, their homes burned, and they were subjected to public humiliation. By 1794, the situation had deteriorated to the point that the government's authority was lost throughout western Pennsylvania. The people declared open rebellion against the government. It was during this time that the term was coined, the Whiskey Rebellion. This was not just a protest, but the first major challenge to the new American system. The rebellion divided the country into two camps: those who believed that a strong government was necessary to keep the country going, and those who believed that government was there to serve the people, not to rule them. This contradiction became the foundation of America's political spirit. When news reached President George Washington, he was shocked. He knew that if the rebellion was not stopped, the new country would fall apart. He donned his military uniform again and decided to lead the army himself. Imagine, a president leading an army against his own citizens. This decision was as historic as it was dangerous. Alexander Hamilton stood by Washington during this time. For him, the rebellion was not just a tax issue, but a test of a federal authority. If we retreat now, the idea of government will be weakened forever, Hamilton said. He had one thing in mind: only a strong government can hold a united nation together. But critics say that this very idea became the root of the central government versus civil liberties conflict in American politics. Washington ordered the mobilization of troops from across the country. About 13,000 soldiers were mobilized, the largest military operation in the United States at the time. When the news reached the rebels, they were shaken. They knew that the matter was serious. Some surrendered, some fled, and a few leaders went into hiding. Washington himself led the army to Pennsylvania. Imagine, America's first president riding a horse, with soldiers soaking in the rain, going to explain to his own people. The scene was nothing short of a fairy tale. But the interesting thing is that Washington's goal was not just to fight, but to restore peace by intimidation. He wanted a show of force to cool the rebellion, and that's what happened. When the army reached the western territories, most of the rebels had dispersed. Some were captured, but no blood was shed. Washington sent a strong message that the new American government was not weak, but knew how to enforce its own writ. This was the first successful test of American federal authority. After the rebellion was crushed, the government convicted 2 men of treason, but Washington later pardoned them. It was a symbolic decision, a show of mercy with power. He showed that the government wanted to be fair, not tyrannical. This moment became the basis for the balance of power and tolerance in American politics. Interestingly, public opinion was divided. Some saw Washington's action as a sign of national unity. Others said it was the first stain on the principles of democracy. A farmer wrote in a newspaper, "We rebelled against the king to gain our freedom, and now we see our own president become king." These words truly reflected the public sentiment of the time. The Whiskey Rebellion created a political divide in America. The differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans widened. Hamilton's supporters saw it as a triumph of government power, while Jefferson's followers saw it as an attack on public rights. This division later became the basis for American political parties. Historians still view the rebellion from different perspectives. Some say it was the first evidence of the strength of American federal power. Others believe it was the beginning of the suppression of democratic voices. The Whiskey Rebellion taught America that discipline is essential to freedom, wrote one historian. And perhaps this balance is the secret to a nation's sustainability. Now the question is, 200 years later, does this story still make sense today? Absolutely. Because governments around around the world still face protests over taxes. People still ask the question, how powerful can government be? And how far can the voice of the people be heard? The Whiskey Rebellion is not just history, it is a mirror, showing us that the relationship between power and the people has always been fragile. After the Whiskey Rebellion, one thing became very clear. The power of the federal government was real. It was no longer an ideological institution, but a reality capable of enforcing the law. George Washington's move was a message to the American people. Democracy is not anarchy, freedom without order. But some people took the phrase as an alarm bell. To him, if the government suppressed a protest against the liquor tax today, tomorrow it might call any dissent insurrection. This thought would later resonate in American political debates. After the rebellion, a strange fear settled over rural America. People felt that their voice had been weakened. When Washington's troops passed through their towns, children would peer out of windows and adults would look with fear. It was the moment when the people first realized that their government could also show power, the same government they considered their own. That is, the sentiment of we the people began to change, for the first time, to we fear the government. Economically, the rebellion did bring some improvement. The government managed to regulate debt, raise taxes, and gradually stabilize the economy. But things remained difficult for small farmers. The whiskey tax was eventually repealed, but its scars lingered in the public mind. That is why anti-tax sentiment became an emotional slogan in America. Time passed, but the Whiskey Rebellion became an ad symbol, a balance between popular resistance, rural autonomy, and federal power. This incident is cited repeatedly in American political history, especially when the government discusses taxes or the use of force. Someone or other says, we must remember, once a whiskey sparked a revolution. Interestingly, this crisis did not damage George Washington's reputation. On the contrary, he emerged as a stronger leader than before. His decision was controversial, but the nation saw him as a leader who was not afraid to make difficult decisions. And this became the true hallmark of Washington's leadership, that he balanced justice with power. After the end of the Whiskey Rebellion, America took a new turn. The country learned that if democracy was to survive, it could not exist without order and law. But what was the price of this lesson? Public trust. The rural classes felt that the government was no longer theirs, but had become a powerful center that imposed decisions on them. This feeling later gave rise to the center versus the states conflict in American politics. Hamilton certainly built a strong economy through his policies, but his thinking tended towards centralism. On the other hand, leaders like Jefferson still believed that real power should rest with the people and the states. This ideological divide later grew between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and if you look closely, the Whiskey Rebellion was the first practical expression of this division. George Washington said many times in the last years of his presidency that he realized that freedom meant not just freedom from the law, but equality under the law. But his opponents considered this to be political justification. To them, Washington had set a dangerous precedent that the government could use the army against the people. Some called it the first threat to democracy, while others called it a victory for national security. But both stories had one truth in common. America was no longer the simple revolutionary country that was founded only on the slogan of freedom, but had now become an institution that knew how to assert its power. Over time, the impact of the Whiskey Rebellion was not limited to the pages of history, but became part of the American political psyche. Even today, when a politician talks about the tax system or federal power, he unconsciously repeats the same incident. This is why the Whiskey Rebellion is still a symbol for any government that ignoring the people is never a safe decision. Another interesting aspect is that this event also gave birth to the American media. The newspapers of the time presented this rebellion in the narrative of the people's defeat and the government's victory. Public opinion began to change. People now began to express their feelings through newspapers. Thus, the Whiskey Rebellion caused a revolution not only on the political but also on the social level. By 1795, things had calmed down completely, but the gap that this rebellion created between the government and the people remained for years. Presidents who came after George Washington faced the same challenge again and again, and whether to use force or try to persuade the people. Imagine for a moment if Washington had chosen the path of negotiations instead of sending troops at that time. Would history have been different? Perhaps yes. But perhaps in that case, the foundation of the federal government would have been weaker. This is perhaps the most interesting aspect of history, that some decisions seem right at the time, but their effects are felt for generations. Some historians say that the Whiskey Rebellion was actually the first real test of American unity. If this rebellion had succeeded, the United States might have broken up into small independent regions. But because the government had established its writ, it showed the world that America was a united state. This event was the event that in the years to come, America stood on the idea of the rule of law, and this idea later became the basis of the American constitutional tradition. But the rebellion also had another unexpected result: the power of popular sentiment in politics. Farmers and workers felt that if they organized, their voice could reach the government. This idea later resurfaced in the form of populist movements. That is, a seemingly suppressed rebellion encouraged future generations to protest. This is the most interesting paradox of history. No matter how much power is suppressed, oppressed, it returns in some form or another. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson abolished the whiskey tax as soon as he became president. "We want the people's trust, not their money," he said. The decision was symbolic, but it sent a new message, that the relationship between government and the people is not just about law, but about trust. Jefferson's move temporarily erased the memory of the Whiskey Rebellion, but its lesson has never been forgotten. When we look at the event today, we see not just a rebellion, but an entire philosophy, a philosophy of balance between power and the people. Whenever a citizen in modern America questions the policies of government, he is unconsciously reviving the same spirit that was ignited among the farmers of western Pennsylvania in 1794. Time has passed, governments have changed, but the question remains, how far should power go, and when does the people cross the line? Perhaps this is the question that has no definitive answer, but if the Whiskey Rebellion has taught us anything, it is that in a democracy, neither the government is completely powerful, nor the people completely free. The two have to be in balance with each other, and this balance is the basis of true freedom. As we conclude this story, it is imperative to think, if a new Whiskey Rebellion were to occur today, against a new tax, against a policy for example, would the government's response be the same? Do we still want peace through law, or agreement through dialogue? This is a question not just of American history, but of every nation in every era. Perhaps that is why the Whiskey Rebellion never gets old. It is a mirror, in which every generation sees its government and its freedom reflected. And finally, a question for you. Is it sometimes a popular rebellion that reminds a nation of its identity? This is the moment where history, politics, and humanity are intertwined. And that is the Whiskey Rebellion. A rebellion that is not over, just alive in a new form.